Sometimes the cruelest moment in a person's life becomes their greatest blessing. A father's drunken joke becomes a daughter's salvation when he carelessly hands his paralyzed child to a towering stranger in a dusty frontier saloon. The giant. Cowboy called Granger has blood on his hands and war in his past. Everyone sees a broken girl in a wheelchair. He sees a fighter waiting to wake up. When the town watches this unlikely pair, they expect failure. But what they witness instead changes everything they thought they knew about strength, family, and second chances. Can a battle-scarred giant and a forgotten girl find the family they never knew they needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried dust and broken dreams through the main street of Millbrook, a frontier town that had seen better decades. Wooden buildings leaned against each other like old men sharing secrets, their paint peeling away in long strips that curled and danced with each gust. The saloon doors swung lazily on rusted hinges, releasing bursts of tobacco smoke and bitter laughter into the fading daylight. Inside the Red Canyon saloon, kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across scarred wooden tables where men gathered to forget their failures. The air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, spilled whiskey, and the kind of desperation that settles into a man's bones when he's run out of places to run. Behind the bar, bottles of amber liquid stood like sentries guarding against sobriety and clear thinking. At a corner table sat a man whose presence filled the room despite his silence. Granger, no one knew his first name, and fewer still dared to ask, hunched over a half-empty bottle like a giant, folding himself into a child's chair. His weathered hands, scarred from countless battles, both foreign and domestic, wrapped around the glass with the practiced grip of someone who had held many things that could kill. A faded cavalry sword hung at his hip, its brass guard tarnished, but its edge still keen. The years had carved deep lines around his grey eyes, each one telling a story he preferred to keep buried. His black hair, streaked with premature silver, fell past his collar in waves that spoke of months without proper grooming. A thick beard covered most of his face, hiding scars that ran deeper than flesh. When he moved, it was with the careful precision of a man who understood that his size made every gesture a potential threat. Granger had wandered into Millbrook 3 days ago, trailing dust and silence like a storm cloud, seeking somewhere to reign. The townspeople watched him with the wariness reserved for wounded animals, dangerous, unpredictable, best observed from a safe distance. He asked for nothing more than a bottle and a corner where shadows could keep him company. The bartender, a nervous man named Pete, who had learned to read trouble in a customer's eyes, obliged without question. The war had ended 15 years ago, but for men like Granger, some battles never reached their conclusion. He had served under Sherman, had seen Atlanta burn, and watched good men die for causes that seemed smaller with each passing year. The blue uniform was long since discarded, but the weight of command still pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible yoke. On this particular evening, as the sun painted the western horizon in shades of copper and regret, another regular patron stumbled through the saloon doors. Jake Morrison moved with the unsteady gait of a man whose legs had forgotten how to carry him without liquid assistance. His clothes, once respectable, now bore the stains of a man who had stopped caring about appearances around the same time he stopped caring about tomorrow. Jake had been different once. The townspeople remembered when he arrived 5 years ago, with his wife Mary and their young daughter Sarah. He had been a man with plans then, full of talk about building something lasting in this hard country. He had purchased a small homestead on the outskirts of town, cleared the land with his own hands, and built a modest house where love could take root and grow. But the frontier had a way of testing a man's resolve, and Jake's test came in the form of a rattlesnake that spooked his horse while Sarah rode behind him. The accident had stolen the use of her legs and, 3 months later, claimed Mary's life from a fever born of grief and exhaustion. Jake never forgave himself for either loss, and whiskey became his confessor, his judge, and his only constant companion. Now Sarah Morrison sat in her wooden wheelchair beside the saloon's back entrance, her small hands folded in her lap as she waited for her father to drink himself into enough of a stupor that she could guide him home. At 14, she possessed the patience of someone twice her age, and the quiet dignity of a person who had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible. Her dark hair hung in careful braids that she maintained herself, a small act of defiance against the world's assumption that she was helpless. Intelligent brown eyes missed nothing, cataloging every detail of human behavior with the analytical mind of someone who had learned to read situations for signs of danger or opportunity. She wore simple clothes, mended and remended, but kept clean through her own meticulous care. Sarah had taught herself to read using her mother's small collection of books, spending long hours puzzling over poetry and scripture while her father worked the land. After the accident, after Mary's death, books became her escape from a world that seemed determined to shrink around her. She read everything she could find, newspapers left behind by travelers, mail-order catalogues, even the labels on medicine. E-bottles. Knowledge was the only currency she possessed, and she hoarded it like a miser hoards gold. The other children in Millbrook had initially tried to include her in their games, but her wheelchair made her a liability in their rough play. Eventually, they learned to look through her rather than at her, a social blindness that hurt more than outright cruelty. The adults were no better, offering pity in place of respect, and treating her like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be known. Tonight, as autumn's chill crept through the saloon's gaps and cracks, Jake Morrison was reaching the bottom of his third bottle and the depths of his latest bout of self-loathing. The other patrons had learned to give him space when he reached this stage, recognizing the dangerous combination of grief and alcohol that could turn a broken man into a volatile one. "Look at her," Jake slurred, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated failures. He gestured toward Sarah with an unsteady hand that trembled from more than drink. "My beautiful broken daughter. Can't walk, can't dance, can't even help with the work. What kind of man raises a child who can't stand on her own 2 feet?" The saloon fell quiet except for the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. Men studied, their drinks with sudden intensity, uncomfortable witnesses to a father's public dissolution. Sarah kept her eyes down, her cheeks burning with shame that wasn't hers to carry, but which she bore nonetheless. Granger looked up from his corner table, his grey eyes focusing on the scene with the sharp attention of a predator assessing a situation. He had seen men break before, had watched the weight of loss crush spirits stronger than Jake Morrison's. But something in the girl's stillness, in the way she absorbed her father's words without flinching, caught his notice. "You know what?" Jake continued, his voice growing louder as alcohol gave his bitterness a megaphone. "Maybe she'd be better off with someone who could appreciate what she is, instead of what she ain't." He looked around the room with wild eyes, searching for validation or challenge, finding only uncomfortable silence. His gaze landed on Granger, taking in the man's size, his weapons, his air of barely contained violence. In Jake's addled mind, an idea began to form, one born of self-hatred and whiskey logic. "You there, big fellow, you look like a man who's seen the world. Bet you could teach her things her old man never could." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. She had endured her father's drinking, his neglect, his gradual transformation from the man who once carried her on his shoulders to this broken stranger who saw her as a reminder of his failures. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. Granger set down his glass with deliberate care, the sound echoing in the sudden silence like a coffin lid closing. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed and the threat of someone capable of enforcing that. "Obedience, that's your daughter, Morrison, mind your words." But Jake was beyond the reach of wisdom or warning. The alcohol had dissolved whatever remained of his judgment, leaving only the raw wound of his pain and a desperate need to make someone else responsible for the wreckage of his life. "She's a burden," he said, the words falling like stones into still water. "Beautiful as her mother was, but what good is beauty when it comes with wheels instead of legs? Take her. I bet a man like you could find some use for her." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, poisoning everything it touched. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her, the last foundation of her security crumbling away like sand. Her father, the man who had once sung her lullabies and promised to protect her from all harm, was offering her to a stranger like a hand in poker. Granger rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a man whose size belied his grace. He towered above the other patrons, his presence filling the room like a thundercloud pregnant with lightning. His hand didn't move toward his weapon, but everyone in the saloon was suddenly aware of its location. "You're drunk, Morrison, go home, sleep it off." But Jake had passed beyond the point where reason could reach him. He stood on unsteady legs, swaying like a tree in a strong wind, and pointed at his daughter with a hand that shook with more than liquor. "I'm serious. Look at her, smart as a whip, prettier than her mother ever was, but stuck in that chair forever. What kind of life can I give her? What kind of husband will want her? Take her. Consider it a trade for all the whiskey you've bought in my town." Sarah closed her eyes, wishing she could close her ears as well. She had known her father's love was conditional, had felt it eroding with each bottle, each bitter word, each look of disappointment when he caught sight of her chair. But she had never imagined it could disappear entirely, leaving behind only this stranger who wore her father's face and spoke with his voice while selling her dignity for the price of admission to his private hell. When she opened her eyes, she found herself looking directly at Granger. His grey gaze held hers with an intensity that seemed to see past her chair, past her circumstances, past everything the world had labelled her, to something deeper underneath. In that moment, she saw something she had almost forgotten existed: respect. The big man studied her for a long moment, taking in her composed posture despite her father's betrayal, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that held her together when everything around her was falling apart. He saw what Jake Morrison was too broken to recognize. Not a burden, but a treasure that had been discarded by someone too blind to understand its worth. Granger walked across the room with measured steps, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Like a judge approaching the bench, he stopped in front of Sarah's chair and, to everyone's surprise, removed his hat and inclined his head in a gesture of respect that no one in that room had ever shown her. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice gentle despite its deep timbre, "if you'll have me, I'd be honored to see you safely home tonight." The simple dignity of the gesture, the way he asked for her consent instead of assuming her compliance, hit Sarah like a physical blow. Tears she had held back through years of disappointment and months of neglect finally spilled over, cutting clean tracks down her dusty cheeks. Jake Morrison, too drunk to understand the magnitude of what he had done, laughed with bitter satisfaction. "See? Even a stranger can see she's better off somewhere else. Take her, Granger. Consider it my gift to you both." And in that moment, as Sarah looked up at the scarred giant who had shown her more respect in 5 minutes than her own father, had managed in months, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She placed her small hand in his large, calloused one and nodded. "I'll go with you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the saloon's windows. "If you'll have me." Granger's grip tightened around her fingers, not possessively but protectively, like a man who had just been entrusted with something precious and fragile. He looked down at this brave girl who had just agreed to trust her life to a stranger, rather than remain with the father who had just traded her away, and something long dormant stirred in his chest. "Then we'd best be going," he said simply, lifting her from the wheelchair and setting her gently on his horse before folding the chair and securing it behind his saddle. As they rode into the night, leaving Jake Morrison to his bottle and his regrets, neither Granger nor Sarah could have predicted that this moment of mutual rescue would become the foundation for the most unlikely family the frontier had ever seen. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain as Granger's horse picked its way carefully along the moonlit trail. Sarah sat in front of him, her wooden wheelchair secured behind the saddle with rope that he had tied with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood the importance of keeping precious things safe. The silence between them stretched like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross, filled with the weight of what had just transpired and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Sarah's hands gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles, not from fear of falling, but from the overwhelming reality that her entire world had changed in the span of a few whispered words. The man behind her was a stranger, a giant with blood on his hands and shadows in his past. Yet he had shown her more dignity in 5 minutes than she had received in months from the man who was supposed to love her most. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on packed earth. Granger's response came after a long moment, as if he were choosing each word with the care of a man defusing a bomb. "I've got a camp, about a mile, outside town. Nothing fancy, but it's dry and there's a fire already laid. We can figure out the rest come morning." The simplicity of his answer somehow made it more reassuring. No grand promises, no elaborate plans, just the basic human decency of shelter and safety for one more night. Sarah had grown tired of grand promises anyway. Her father had made plenty of those, and each one had proven as substantial as smoke. As they rode, Sarah found herself studying the massive hands that held the reins with surprising gentleness. They were working hands, scarred and calloused, with the long fingers of someone who had learned to handle delicate tasks despite their size. She noticed how he guided the horse around the rougher patches of trail without being asked, how he adjusted his posture to make her seat more stable. Small kindnesses that spoke of a man who understood what it meant to care for someone vulnerable. "Why did you do it?" The question escaped before she could stop it, carried on a breath of wind that made her wish she could pull it back. "Do what?" "Stand up for me. Take me with you. You don't know me from Adam's off-ox." Granger was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "I know what it's like to be thrown away," he said simply. "Figured you deserved better than that." The camp, when they reached it, was exactly as he had described. Nothing fancy, but thoughtfully arranged. A canvas lean-to stretched between 2 sturdy trees provided shelter from the wind, while a circle of stones contained the cold ashes of a fire that had been properly banked for the night. A small pile of split wood sat nearby, dry and ready for lighting. His few possessions were arranged with military precision: bedroll, saddlebags, and the various tools of a man who lived by his wits and his weapons. Granger dismounted first, then turned to help Sarah down with the same careful respect he had shown in the saloon. He unfolded her wheelchair and positioned it beside the horse, waiting for her to indicate she was ready before lifting her into it. The gesture was so natural, so free of pity or awkwardness, that Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "You've done this before," she observed, as he began building up the fire with practiced efficiency. "Done what?" "Helped someone who couldn't walk." His hands stilled for a moment, and in the flickering light of the growing flames, Sarah caught a glimpse of something raw and unguarded crossing his features. "My brother," he said quietly, "lost his legs to a cannonball at Gettysburg, lived another 3 years before the fever took him, learned a lot about what folks need and what they don't." The fire caught and spread, casting dancing shadows across the camp and illuminating the careful way Granger arranged the space to accommodate both of them. He positioned a log for himself to sit on, close enough to tend the fire, but far enough away that Sarah wouldn't feel crowded. He filled a battered coffee pot from his water barrel and set it near the flames to heat. "You don't have to stay out here because of me," Sarah said, watching him work. "I mean, you could take me back to town tomorrow. Find someone more suitable." More suitable to what? Granger's voice carried an edge of something that might have been anger, though not directed at her. "Take care of you, appreciate what you've got to offer, because if that's what you're thinking, you're dead wrong about something important." Sarah looked down at her hands, folded in her lap like birds that had forgotten how to fly. "I'm not much good to anybody. Can't walk, can't do the work that needs doing. My own father, your father," Granger interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, "is a man who's let his grief turn him into something less than he used to be. That doesn't make him right about you. That makes him wrong about what matters." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to Sarah with the casual assumption that she could handle it herself. The simple gesture, treating her as capable rather than fragile, was like medicine to a wound she hadn't even realized was still bleeding. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked, genuinely curious. Everyone else saw the chair first, the limitation before the person. Even her father, in his better moments, looked at her with a mixture of love and pity that made her feel like a beautiful mistake. Granger studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors holding captured stars. "I see someone who's been holding herself together while the world fell apart around her. I see intelligence, strength, and a kind of grace that most folks spend their whole lives trying to find." He paused, taking another sip of coffee. "I see someone who deserves a chance to find out what she's capable of." The words hit Sarah like a physical force, nearly knocking the breath from her lungs. No one, not her mother, not her father, not a single soul in Millbrook, had ever spoken to her about capability, about potential, about what she might become rather than what she couldn't do. "You don't know me," she whispered, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "I know enough," Granger replied. "I know you've been taking care of a grown man who should have been taking care of you. I know you've been keeping yourself clean and dignified in circumstances that would have broken lesser people. I know you speak like someone who's educated herself, and I know you've got the kind of courage it takes to trust a stranger when your own family fails you." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she had shed in the saloon. These came from a place deeper than hurt. They came from the dangerous, fragile place where hope lived. "What happens now?" she asked. Granger leaned forward, his massive frame somehow managing to convey both strength and gentleness. "Now we figure out what you want to happen. This isn't about me rescuing you, Sarah Morrison. This is about you deciding what kind of life you want to build." The use of her name, spoken with respect and consideration, was like hearing music after years of silence. Sarah looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift, seeing possibilities in their movement that she had never dared to imagine. "I want to learn," she said finally. "I want to be useful. I want to matter to someone the way they matter to me." "Then that's what we'll work toward," Granger said simply. "One day at a time, one skill at a time, until you're exactly who you're meant to be." As the fire settled into glowing coals and the night deepened around them, Sarah Morrison allowed herself to believe, for the first time in years, that her story might have more chapters yet to be written. The wheelchair beside her was still, the same wood and metal it had always been, but somehow it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the beginning of something she had never dared to hope for, a chance to become herself. Dawn came slowly to the high country, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Sarah of her mother's favorite quilt. She woke to the sound of Granger moving quietly around the camp, his large frame surprisingly graceful, as he coaxed the fire back to life and set water to boil for coffee. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn's full arrival, sharp and clean in her lungs. "Sleep well?" he asked without turning around, somehow sensing that she was awake despite her silence. "Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted, surprised by the truth of it. The bedroll Granger had arranged for her beside the lean-to had been more comfortable than her own bed back at the homestead, partly because of the careful way he had positioned it to account for her needs, but mostly because she had slept without the knot of anxiety that usually accompanied her father's drinking nights. Granger handed her a cup of coffee and a plate of beans and hardtack. Simple fare, but prepared with the attention to detail that spoke of someone who understood that dignity could be found in the smallest gestures. He had cut the hardtack into manageable pieces and warmed the beans to just the right temperature, considerations that no one had thought to offer her in years. "We need to talk about practical matters," he said, settling onto his log with his own breakfast. "Can't keep camping out here indefinitely, and you'll need more than the clothes on your back." Sarah nodded, having spent much of the night thinking about the same concerns. "I don't have much. Father sold most of Mother's things after she died, and what's left isn't worth the trip back to get it." She paused, then added quietly, "Besides, I don't think I'm welcome there anymore. Your father said things he can't take back." Granger agreed, "But that doesn't mean we can't plan for the future. Tell me what you know how to do. Reading, writing, numbers, cooking, sewing, anything that might be useful." The question surprised Sarah. Most people, when they bothered to ask about her abilities at all, focused on what she couldn't do rather than what she could. "I can read and write better than most folks in town. Mother taught me numbers and basic figuring before she died, and I've kept up with it since. I can sew well enough to mend clothes and make simple things. I used to help with cooking when Mother was alive, though I haven't had much practice since." Granger nodded thoughtfully. "That's more than most people can claim. What about things you've always wanted to learn but never had the chance?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question touched on dreams she had barely admitted to herself, longings that seemed foolish for someone in her circumstances. "I always wanted to learn about the world beyond Millbrook. Geography, history, what other places are like, and She stopped, embarrassed by the admission she was about to make. "Go on." "I always thought it would be interesting to know about weapons, how they work, how to use them properly. I know that sounds strange for someone like me, but..." "Why would it sound strange?" Granger interrupted. "Being able to defend yourself is practical knowledge, especially out here. Your legs don't work, but your arms and eyes are fine. No reason you couldn't learn to shoot as well as anyone." The casual way he dismissed the obstacles that everyone else saw as insurmountable took Sarah's breath away. In less than 24 hours, this man had shown her more faith in her potential than she had received in years. "You'd teach me?" "I'd teach you everything I know that might be useful," Granger replied. "But first things first. We need to get you properly outfitted and find a more permanent arrangement than camping under the stars." They spent the morning discussing practical necessities, clothes that would be suitable for outdoor life, modifications to her wheelchair that would make it more stable on rough terrain, tools and supplies they would need for an extended stay in the wilderness. Granger approached each topic with the methodical thoroughness of a military man planning a campaign, but he solicited Sarah's input on every decision, treating her as a partner rather than a burden to be managed. When they rode into Millbrook later that morning, Sarah noticed the stairs immediately. Word of the previous night's events had spread through the small community with the speed that gossip achieved in places where entertainment was scarce. Women whispered behind their hands as they passed, while men studied Granger with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Their first stop was Morrison's General Store, run by Annie Patterson, a widow who had arrived in Millbrook 2 years earlier with enough capital to buy the failing business and enough sense to make it prosper. Annie was a woman of middle years, with kind eyes and graying brown hair that she wore in a practical bun. She had always treated Sarah with courtesy when Jake brought her to town, one of the few adults who spoke to her directly rather than around her. "Sarah Morrison," Annie said as they entered. Her voice warm despite the circumstances that had brought them there. "I heard about last night. I'm sorry, child. No one should have to endure what your father put you through." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Sarah replied, grateful for the woman's directness. Mr. Granger and I are hoping to purchase some supplies. Annie's eyes moved to Granger, taking in his size and the quiet way he positioned himself protectively near Sarah's chair. Mr. Granger, she said with a polite nod, I hope you're planning to treat this girl with the respect she deserves. That's my intention, Granger replied simply. Good. Annie turned back to Sarah. What do you need, dear? They spent the next hour selecting practical clothing, sturdy dresses that would stand up to outdoor life, a warm coat, boots that would fit properly over her thin legs, and undergarments that would provide comfort and dignity. Annie proved to be an invaluable ally, not only in helping Sarah choose appropriate items, but in treating the entire transaction as normal business rather than an object of pity or curiosity. When they moved on to camping supplies and tools, Granger took the lead, selecting items with the expertise of someone who had lived rough for years. But he continued to consult Sarah on every purchase, explaining his choices and asking for her preferences. The small, leather-bound book of poetry that caught her eye earned his immediate approval and a place in their growing collection of supplies. You'll want to keep your mind sharp, he said, noticing her hesitation about the expense. Books are tools too, just different kinds of tools. As they prepared to leave, Annie drew Sarah aside with the excuse of helping her arrange her new purchases in the wheelchair's carrying pouch. That man cares about you, she said quietly. I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he includes you in every decision. But be careful, Sarah. The world has opinions about arrangements like this, and not all of them are charitable. I know, Sarah replied. But Mrs. Patterson, for the first time in years, someone is treating me like I matter. Like I might actually be capable of something more than just existing. I can't walk away from that. Annie nodded slowly. Then you hold on to it, child. And if you ever need anything, supplies, advice, or just someone to talk to, you know where to find me. As they rode back toward Granger's camp, Sarah felt the weight of curious eyes following their progress. She knew that her decision to leave with him had set tongues wagging throughout Millbrook, and she knew that the coming days would test both their resolve and their growing partnership. But for the first time since her mother's death, Sarah Morrison felt like she was moving toward something, rather than simply enduring whatever happened to her. The book of poetry sat in her lap like a promise of intellectual nourishment, while the practical clothes and supplies represented a future where she might be more than just a burden to be managed. The wooden wheelchair beneath her still limited where she could go and how quickly she could get there, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a starting point. The custom rifle rest took Granger 3 days to build, working in the evenings by firelight after spending the days teaching Sarah basic wilderness skills. He carved it from seasoned oak with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed, shaping each piece to accommodate the unique challenges of shooting from a seated position. Sarah watched him work with fascination, noting how his large hands could manipulate the smallest details with surprising precision. He explained each step of the process as he went, treating her as a student rather than a spectator. The key is stability, he said, fitting the adjustable legs to the rest's base. Your chair gives you a solid platform, but you need something to eliminate the small movements that throw off your aim. This will let you make fine adjustments for elevation and windage without having to compensate for your body position. You really think I can learn to shoot accurately? Sarah asked, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the nearly finished rest. I think you can learn to shoot better than most men in Millbrook, Granger replied without hesitation. You've got steady hands, good eyes, and the kind of patience that marksmanship requires. The mechanics are just mechanics. They can be learned by anyone willing to put in the time. When the rest was finished, Granger set up a target against a fallen log 50 yards from their camp. The target was nothing fancy, just a piece of white cloth with a charcoal circle drawn in the center. But it represented something Sarah had never imagined possible. Remember what I taught you about breathing? Granger said, as he helped her position the rifle on the custom rest. Take your time, let your natural pause fall between heartbeats, and squeeze the trigger straight back like you're trying to surprise yourself. Sarah's first shot went wide, the unfamiliar recoil and noise startling her despite Granger's warnings. But her second attempt found the edge of the target, and her third struck close enough to the center to draw a grunt of approval from her instructor. Good grouping for someone who's never held a rifle before yesterday, he said, studying the target through a small telescope. Your instincts are sound. It's just a matter of practice now. Over the following weeks, their daily routine settled into a pattern that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings began with marksmanship practice, with Sarah gradually extending her effective range as her confidence and skill grew. Afternoons were devoted to other practical skills: map reading, weather prediction, basic field medicine, and the 100 small techniques that separated frontiersmen from city folk. Evenings belonged to books and conversation. Sarah would read aloud from her volume of poetry, while Granger worked on equipment maintenance or prepared their simple meals. He proved to be a surprisingly well-educated audience, offering insights into literature and history that revealed an intellectual depth she hadn't expected from a man who lived by his gun. "Where did you learn so much about books?" she asked one evening after a particularly thoughtful discussion about Tennyson's use of imagery. "My mother was a school teacher before she married," Granger replied, not looking up from the leather harness. He was mending. She insisted that all her boys learn to read and write properly, said ignorance was a choice rather than a condition. "After I joined the army, reading helped pass the time between battles." "Do you miss it? The army, I mean." Granger's hands stilled for a moment, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something dark crossing his features. "I miss the certainty of it sometimes. Knowing who the enemy was, what the mission required, having clear objectives to accomplish. Civilian life is more complicated." "Is that why you keep moving? To avoid the complications?" "Partly." He resumed his work, but his voice carried a weight that suggested deeper currents beneath the simple answer. "And partly because staying in one place too long makes it harder to forget the things you'd rather not remember." Sarah wanted to press further, to understand the shadows that sometimes flickered behind his grey eyes, but she had learned to recognize when Granger needed space for his thoughts. Instead, she returned to her reading, content to let comfortable silence fill the gap between them. Their peaceful routine was interrupted one afternoon by the arrival of Annie Patterson, who rode out to their camp on a sturdy mare with the determined expression of a woman on a mission. Sarah was practicing her shooting when Annie arrived, and she felt a flutter of pride when her shot struck within inches of the target's center. "Impressive," Annie said, dismounting and walking over to examine Sarah's work. "I don't think there are 3 men in Millbrook who could match that shooting." "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said, lowering the rifle and turning her wheelchair to face their visitor. "What brings you out here?" Annie's expression grew serious. "I'm afraid I have some troubling news. There's been talk in town, not good talk. Some folks are questioning the propriety of your arrangement with Mr. Granger. There's even been mention of involving the territorial authorities." Granger appeared beside Sarah's chair, with the silent swiftness that sometimes reminded her he had been a soldier. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that comes from small minds and idle time," Annie replied. "Mrs. Hutchins has been particularly vocal about what she calls an inappropriate situation involving a vulnerable young woman and a man of questionable character. She's been rallying support for some kind of intervention." Sarah felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety. The freedom she had found in these past weeks, the sense of growing into her own potential, suddenly felt fragile and threatened. "What does that mean? Intervention?" "Nothing good," Annie said grimly. "Best case, they try to force you back to your father's care. Worst case, they petition to have you declared incompetent and placed in some kind of institutional custody." "They can't do that," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She had seen how quickly the world could change for someone in her position, how little agency she actually possessed when others decided her fate. "They can try," Granger said, his voice carrying the hard edge that suggested he was already thinking through tactical options. "The question is whether we're going to let them succeed." Annie nodded approvingly. "That's what I was hoping to hear. Sarah, you've grown stronger and more confident in these past weeks than I've seen you in years. Whatever Mr. Granger is teaching you, it's working, but you need to be prepared for the fight that's coming." "What kind of fight?" Sarah asked. "The kind where people will judge you based on what they think they see rather than what you actually are," Annie replied. "The kind where you'll need to prove your competence and your right to make your own choices. The kind where you'll discover who your real friends are." As Annie prepared to leave, she pulled a wrapped package from her saddlebags and handed it to Sarah. "A few things that might come in handy. And remember, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." After Annie rode away, Sarah unwrapped the package to find ammunition for her rifle, a small medical kit, and a jar of preserved peaches, practical gifts from a practical woman who understood the challenges they faced. "Are you worried?" Sarah asked Granger as they watched Annie's figure disappear into the distance. "I'm concerned," he replied, "but not defeated. We've got something they don't understand, something they can't take away unless we let them." "What's that?" Granger looked down at her with the expression she had come to treasure, one that saw her potential rather than her limitations. "We've got the truth on our side, and we've got each other." That evening, as Sarah practiced her shooting by lamplight and Granger cleaned his weapons with methodical care, both of them understood that their quiet period of growth and discovery was drawing to a close. The world beyond their camp was demanding an accounting, and they would need every skill they had learned to meet the challenge ahead. The hand-drawn map spread across Sarah's lap like a window into a world she had never imagined existed beyond Millbrook's narrow boundaries. Granger had spent 3 evenings creating it, using charcoal and ink to mark every stream, ridge, and hidden valley within a day's ride of their camp. His careful annotations noted water sources, game trails, defensible positions, and the kinds of details that could mean the difference between life and death for travelers in unfamiliar territory. "The key to surviving in country like this," Granger said, pointing to a series of interconnected canyons on the map's eastern edge, "is understanding that the land itself is your best ally or your worst enemy, depending on how well you know it." Sarah traced the winding path of Willow Creek with her finger, marveling at how much complexity existed in what she had always thought of as empty wilderness. "You've mapped all of this from memory, and observation. 20 years of military service teaches a man to notice things that might matter later, where the high ground is, which routes offer cover, where someone might set an ambush or make a last stand." His voice carried the weight of experience earned through necessity rather than choice. "Is that how you think about everything, in terms of tactical advantage?" Granger considered the question while pointing out a narrow pass that connected 2 valleys. "It's how I learned to stay alive, but it's not the only way to see the world. Your mother's poetry book has taught me that there are other kinds of maps, ones that chart the territory of the heart and mind." The comment surprised Sarah, as Granger's insights often did. She was beginning to understand that beneath his scarred exterior lived a man of considerable depth, someone who had been shaped by violence but not defined by it. Their lessons in navigation and terrain reading had evolved naturally from Sarah's questions about the world beyond her limited experience. What had begun as simple compass work had expanded into complex discussions of geography, weather patterns, and the subtle signs that revealed the land's secrets to those who knew how to look. "Tell me about the war," Sarah said one afternoon as they studied a section of broken country that Granger had marked as particularly treacherous. "I know it shaped you, but I don't understand how." Granger was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes focused on distant memories that still had the power to cause pain. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the measured cadence of a man choosing his words carefully. The war taught me that good men can be forced to do terrible things for reasons that seem important at the time, but feel hollow when the shooting stops. It taught me that survival and honor don't always point in the same direction, and that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you fight inside your own conscience. Is that why you left the army? Part of it. Granger folded the map with careful precision, his movements betraying nothing of the turmoil Sarah could sense beneath his calm exterior. There came a time when I couldn't reconcile what they were, asking me to do with what I believed was right, so I walked away. And you've been walking ever since. Until now, Granger said, meeting her eyes with an expression that was part vulnerability, part determination. Until I found something worth stopping for. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to examine too closely. Sarah felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing certainty that this man had become far more than a protector or teacher. He had become family. Their deepening bond was tested that same week when Jake Morrison appeared at their camp, riding a borrowed horse and carrying a bottle that was already half empty despite the early hour. Sarah's father looked older than his years, his face bearing the ravages of guilt and alcohol in equal measure. "Sarah," he said, dismounting unsteadily and approaching her wheelchair with the careful steps of a drunk trying to appear sober. "I've come to take you home. This is my home now," Sarah replied quietly, her hands steady on the rifle that lay across her lap. The weeks of training had given her more than marksmanship skills. They had given her the confidence to stand up for herself. Jake's eyes moved to Granger, who stood nearby with the relaxed alertness of a man prepared for trouble. "This isn't right, Sarah. A young woman living out here with a stranger, people talking, people have always talked about me," Sarah interrupted. "The difference is that now I have someone who listens to what I have to say, instead of just talking. About what's wrong with me, I'm your father." "You were my father," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Until the night you traded me away, like I was property instead of your daughter. That man standing behind you is more of a father to me now than you've been since Mother died." Jake flinched, as if he'd been struck, the truth of her words cutting through his alcoholic haze like a blade through silk. "I was drunk. I wasn't thinking clearly. I want to make it right." "Then make it right by leaving us alone," Granger said, speaking for the first time since Jake's arrival. "Your daughter is thriving here. She's learning skills that will serve her well, gaining confidence in herself, becoming the remarkable woman she was always meant to be. Don't destroy that, because your guilt needs somewhere to land. She's my blood. Blood doesn't give you the right to hurt someone," Sarah said, "and it doesn't erase the hurt you've already caused. I've forgiven you, Father, but I won't forget. And I won't go back to being the burden you saw me as." Jake looked between them, seeing something in their partnership that he had never bothered to recognize when Sarah lived under his roof. She sat straighter now, spoke with authority, carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew her own worth. The man beside her treated her with respect that went far beyond mere courtesy. He treated her as an equal, a partner, someone whose opinions mattered. "The whole town is talking," Jake said weakly. "Mrs. Hutchins says it's not proper for a young woman to be living with a man who's not her husband." "Then maybe Mrs. Hutchins should worry about her own affairs instead of mine," Sarah replied. "I'm not asking anyone else to understand my choices, Father. I'm just asking them to respect my right to make them." Jake stood there for several minutes, swaying slightly in the wind that carried the scent of coming winter. Finally, he remounted his horse and looked down at his daughter with eyes that held more sorrow than anger. "I'm sorry, Sarah, for all of it. For the drinking, for the things I said, for not being the father you deserved after your mother died." He paused, struggling with words that came too late to change anything. "I hope you find the happiness you're looking for." As Jake rode away, Sarah felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer Jake Morrison's broken daughter. She was Sarah, student and partner to a man who saw her potential, friend to Annie Patterson, and most importantly, herself. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked Granger as they watched her father's figure disappear into the distance. "I think he's a man who lost his way when grief got the better of him," Granger replied. "Whether he finds his way back or not isn't up to us." That night, as they studied the map by firelight and planned their next day's lessons, Sarah realized that she had crossed an invisible boundary. She was no longer someone being rescued. She was someone choosing her own path, with a partner who respected her right to walk it. Sarah's mother's wedding ring caught the firelight like a captured star as she turned it slowly between her fingers. She had found it wrapped in a piece of faded cloth at the bottom of her small collection of possessions, forgotten until this moment when loneliness and the approaching winter made her search for connections to the woman who had given her life meaning. "I remember when she got this," Sarah said softly, holding the simple gold band up to the light. "Father gave it to her on their wedding day with a promise that they would build something beautiful together in this hard country." Granger looked up from the harness he was mending, his weathered face gentle in the flickering glow of their evening fire. "Tell me about her, about what she was like before the grief took hold." "She was strong," Sarah began, her voice growing warmer as memories surfaced like flowers pushing through winter soil. "Not physically. She was small, even smaller than I am, but strong in all the ways that mattered. She could make Father laugh when the crops failed, could find hope when there didn't seem to be any reason for it, could make our little house feel like a palace just by believing it was one." Granger nodded, understanding the power of a woman who could transform circumstances through sheer force of will and love. He had known such women, his own mother among them, and had learned that their strength was often the foundation upon which entire families built their futures. "She sounds like someone who would be proud of what you've become," he said. "Would she?" Sarah asked, genuine uncertainty coloring her voice. "Sometimes I wonder what she would think of all this. Me living out here with a man I barely knew 2 months ago, learning to shoot and hunt instead of keeping house and preparing for marriage. What do you think she would say?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the ring, as if it might hold answers to questions she was afraid to ask. "I think she would say that happiness is worth more than respectability, and that being true, and to yourself, matters more than meeting other people's expectations. Sounds like a wise woman. She was, and she loved Father, truly loved him, even when he was difficult. After the accident, after she got sick, she made me promise to take care of him. I tried, Granger, I really tried, but I couldn't save him from himself." Granger set down his work and moved closer to Sarah's chair, close enough that she could see the compassion in his grey eyes. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, Sarah. All you can do is save yourself and hope they find their own way eventually. Is that what you did when you left the army?" "Something like that." Granger's expression darkened with memories he rarely shared. "I had a family once, a wife, a son. Lost them both to fever while I was away on campaign. When I came back to an empty house and fresh graves, I thought the guilt might kill me. Maybe I hoped it would." Sarah reached out impulsively and placed her small hand over his large, scarred one. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. How could you? It's not something I talk about." Granger looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "But losing them taught me something important about grief. It either breaks you or it teaches you what really matters. I chose to let it teach me." "What did it teach you?" "That love doesn't end when someone dies, but it can become a prison if you let guilt twist it into something ugly. That the best way to honor the people you've lost is to live in a way that would make them proud. That sometimes the family you choose matters as much as the family you're born into." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. This man who had seemed so intimidating when she first met him was revealing depths of pain and wisdom that resonated with her own losses. They were both orphans in different ways, both carrying wounds that had shaped but not destroyed them. "Is that what this is?" she asked quietly. "Family?" Granger met her eyes with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "It's what I'd like it to be, if you're willing." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the intimacy of the moment. Granger was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his weapon as three riders emerged from the darkness beyond. Their firelight. Sarah recognized them immediately. Tom Henderson, the town's unofficial leader, Dr. Jameson, who had attended her mother during her final illness, and Deputy Marshal Collins, whose presence suggested this was more than a social call. "Evening?" "Hoax," Henderson said, dismounting with the careful politeness of a man delivering bad news. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we need to have a conversation." "About what?" Granger asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Dr. Jameson stepped forward, his medical bag in hand and his expression professionally neutral. "There have been concerns raised about Miss Morrison's welfare. Questions about whether this arrangement is in her best interests." "Whose concerns?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharper than usual. The weeks of training with Granger had given her more than physical skills. They had given her the confidence to challenge authority when it overstepped its bounds. "Mrs. Hutchins has filed a formal complaint with the territorial authorities," Deputy Collins said, consulting a folded document. "She's alleging that you're being held against your will by a man of questionable character, and she's requesting that you be examined by a qualified physician to determine your mental competence." Sarah felt the familiar chill of powerlessness creeping up her spine. All her progress, all her growth, all the dignity she had fought to reclaim was being threatened by the narrow-mindedness of people who had never bothered to see her as anything more than an object of pity. "I'm not being held against my will," she said firmly. "I'm here by choice, learning skills that are making me stronger and more capable than I've ever been in my life." "That may be," Dr. Jameson said gently, "but the law requires that I conduct an examination to verify your mental state and ensure that you're capable of making such decisions for yourself. And if I refuse, then I'm authorized to have you taken into protective custody pending a hearing before the territorial judge," Deputy Collins replied, his hand resting meaningfully on his weapon. Granger stepped protectively closer to Sarah's chair, his massive frame radiating controlled menace. "You're not taking her anywhere without a fight." "Nobody wants a fight," Henderson said quickly, recognizing the danger in the big man's stance. "But Sarah, you have to understand how this looks to people. A young woman, disabled, living alone, with a stranger. People worry. People should worry about their own affairs," Sarah replied, but she could hear the slight tremor in her voice. The ring in her palm suddenly felt like a talisman, connecting her to her mother's strength and the promises she had made to live authentically. "I'll submit to your examination," she said finally, meeting Dr. Jameson's eyes with steady determination. "But I want it understood that I'm doing this voluntarily, to prove my competence, not because I doubt my own judgment." As the doctor began unpacking his medical supplies, Sarah slipped her mother's ring onto her finger for the first time since the funeral. Whatever came next, she would face it as Mary Morrison's daughter, strong, determined, and unashamed of the choices she had made. The crumpled, wanted poster fell from Dr. Jameson's medical bag like a leaf blown by an ill wind, landing face up in the dirt beside Sarah's wheelchair. Even in the flickering firelight, the bold black letters were unmistakable. "Wanted for desertion and murder, $500 reward." Below the text was a drawing that, despite its crude execution, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the man standing protectively beside her. "Well," Deputy Collins said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed, "looks like we've got ourselves a bigger problem than we thought." Sarah stared at the poster, her mind struggling to reconcile the words with everything she knew about Granger. The man described in those harsh terms, deserter, murderer, fugitive, bore no resemblance to the patient teacher who had spent weeks helping her discover her own strength and potential. "That's not who he is," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around their peaceful camp. "The United States Army says different," Collins replied, drawing his weapon with the practiced motion of a man who had been hoping for exactly this opportunity. Captain Marcus Granger, formerly of the 14th Cavalry Regiment, wanted for abandoning his post during the Battle of Wounded Knee, and for the murder of Colonel Harrison Wade. Granger hadn't moved, hadn't reached for his gun, hadn't even flinched at the accusation. He stood like a man who had been expecting this moment for years, his grey eyes fixed on Sarah's face as if her reaction was the only thing that mattered in the world. "Is it true?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the resignation in his expression. "The facts are true," Granger said quietly. "I did leave my post without orders. I did kill Colonel Wade. But the reasons, they wouldn't understand then, and they won't understand now." "Try us," Dr. Jameson said, though his medical examination had been forgotten in favor of this more dramatic revelation. Granger was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memories that still had the power to cause pain. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man unburdening himself of secrets that had been eating at his soul for years. "Wounded Knee wasn't a battle," he began. "It was a massacre waiting to happen. Colonel Wade had orders to disarm the Lakota, but he wanted more than compliance. He wanted blood. He saw an opportunity to make a name for himself by crushing what he called the last of the savage resistance." Henderson shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the tone of a man telling a truth that had been buried under official reports and military pride. "The morning it started," Granger continued, "I was ordered to position my men where they could fire into the camp if trouble began. But when I saw what Wade intended, women, children, old people who had come in under a flag of truce, I couldn't do it. I ordered my men to stand down." "That's desertion," Collins said, though his voice lacked some of its earlier certainty. "That's conscience," Sarah replied firmly. "Go on." "Wade went into a rage when he realized I wouldn't follow his orders. He drew his sidearm and threatened to shoot me for insubordination. Said he'd make an example of any officer who put savage lives above military discipline." Granger's hands clenched unconsciously as the memory played out behind his eyes. "I tried to reason with him, tried to make him see that what he was planning wasn't war. It was butchery. But Wade was beyond reasoning. He was drunk on power and the opportunity to add another victory to his record." "So you killed him," Dr. Jameson said, though it was more statement than question. "I killed him to prevent him from ordering the massacre of 300 innocent people," Granger confirmed. "And then I took my men, and we rode away from the whole damned mess." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a nightbird. Sarah stared at Granger with new understanding, seeing not a criminal, but a man who had sacrificed his career, his reputation, and his freedom to prevent an atrocity. "The official report said you were killed in action along with Colonel Wade," Collins said, consulting the poster again. "How is it you're still alive?" "Because my sergeant, God rest his soul, understood what I'd done and why I'd done it. He filed a report saying we'd both been killed in an Indian attack, gave me a chance to disappear before anyone could ask too many questions." Granger's voice carried deep gratitude for a loyalty that had cost another man his integrity. "I've been Thomas Granger, drifter, ever since. Marcus Granger, captain of cavalry, died that day at Wounded Knee, just like the report said." "But you're still wanted for murder," Collins pointed out, though his weapon had lowered slightly. "By men who would rather see 300 innocents dead than admit that one of their officers was willing to commit atrocities in the name of duty," Sarah said, her voice ringing with conviction. "That's not murder, Deputy Collins. That's heroism." Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss Morrison, I understand your loyalty to this man, but the fact remains that he's a fugitive from military justice. We have a legal obligation. You have a legal obligation to see that justice is done, Sarah interrupted, not to blindly follow orders that perpetuate injustice. Dr. Jameson had been listening to the exchange with the thoughtful expression of a man weighing evidence. Deputy Collins, he said slowly, perhaps we should consider the full circumstances before we act. This man saved countless lives by his actions, and he's been living as an outlaw ever since, Collins replied, though his conviction was clearly wavering. He's been living as a man trying to make amends for a war that asked him to do unconscionable things, Sarah said. Look what he's done for me, for the faith Annie Patterson has in him, for the way he's conducted himself in this community. Does that sound like the behavior of a murderer? Granger watched the debate with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. He had known this day would come eventually, had been prepared for it since the moment he decided to stay in one place long enough to matter to someone. What he hadn't been prepared for was having someone fight for him with the fierce loyalty that Sarah was showing. It doesn't matter what any of us think, he said quietly. The law is the law. I've been running from this for 15 years and I'm tired of running. You don't have to run, Sarah said, turning her wheelchair to face him directly. We can. Fight this. Get a lawyer, tell the truth, let people understand what really happened. And what if they don't understand? What if they decide that military discipline matters more than saving innocent lives? Granger asked gently. What happens? To you then? Then I'll face whatever comes, just like you taught me to do. Sarah's voice carried the strength he had helped her find, the confidence he had nurtured through weeks of patient teaching. You didn't abandon me when the whole world had written me off. I'm not going to abandon you now. Collins looked between them, clearly struggling with the situation that had become far more complex than a simple arrest. The wanted poster in the dirt seemed to mock the evidence of his own eyes, the obvious care between these two unlikely partners, the dignity with which they faced this crisis, the way they had both grown stronger through their association. I need time to think about this, he said finally, holstering his weapon. To send some telegrams, get more information about what really happened at Wounded Knee. And in the meantime, Granger asked, in the meantime, you don't leave this camp without my permission. And Miss Morrison, you still need that medical examination. Not because I doubt your competence, but because the law requires it. As Dr. Jameson began his examination, and the other men settled in to wait, Sarah kept her mother's ring pressed between her palms, like a prayer. She had asked for the courage to face whatever came, and now she would find out if she had learned the lessons Granger had tried to teach her. The truth was finally out in the open, dangerous and liberating in equal measure. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The military compass felt warm in Sarah's palm as Granger pressed it into her hands 3 days later, its brass surface worn smooth by generations of careful use. Federal marshals had arrived in Millbrook that morning, and everyone in camp understood that their time together was drawing to a close. This belonged to my grandfather, Granger said, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotion Sarah could see in his grey eyes. He carried it through the Mexican War. My father carried it through the rebellion, and I carried it until the day I decided that true north wasn't always the same as following orders. Sarah turned the compass over in her hands, studying the intricate engravings that marked it as a family heirloom. Along the rim, someone had etched the words, "Honor above all," in flowing script that spoke of a time when such ideals seemed simpler, more certain. I can't accept this, she said, though her fingers closed around the compass protectively. It belongs in your family. It does belong in my family, Granger replied, meeting her eyes with an expression that left no doubt about his meaning. You are my family, Sarah Morrison, more than blood, more than law, more than anything else that might claim to define such bonds. The formal adoption had been impossible to arrange in the time they had. Territorial law was complex and bureaucratic, requiring months of legal maneuvering that they simply didn't possess. But Annie Patterson had suggested an alternative that carried the weight of frontier custom, if not legal statute. In the presence of Dr. Jameson, Deputy Collins, and Tom Henderson, Granger had formally declared Sarah his chosen daughter and heir, with witnesses to attest to his intention should anything happen to him. "The marshals won't care about frontier customs," Sarah said, though she slipped the compass into the pouch at her side, where it settled against her mother's ring like two talismans joining forces. "Maybe not," Granger agreed. "But they'll care about public opinion, and they'll care about having witnesses who can testify to what really happened at Wounded Knee." The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of preparation and revelation. Deputy Collins, true to his word, had sent telegrams to former members of Granger's regiment, tracking down the men who had served under him during those final, terrible days of the Indian Wars. What he had discovered painted a picture very different from the official reports that branded Granger a deserter and murderer. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, now a blacksmith in Kansas, had provided a sworn statement describing Colonel Wade's increasingly erratic behavior and his explicit orders to fire on non-combatants. Private James Mitchell, working as a schoolteacher in Colorado, corroborated O'Brien's account and added details about Wade's drinking and his obsession with military glory at any cost. Most damning of all, Lieutenant Charles Morrison, no relation to Sarah despite the shared name, had kept a detailed diary that documented Wade's threats against his own officers and his stated intention to finish the Indian problem once and for all. But even with this evidence, the situation remained precarious. Military justice operated by different rules than civilian law, and the men coming to arrest Granger represented a system that valued order and discipline above individual conscience. The fact that he had been proven right about Wade's intentions might mitigate his punishment, but it wouldn't erase his actions or the years he had spent as a fugitive. "Annie's gathering signatures on a petition," Sarah said, trying to keep hope alive in her voice. "Half the town has already signed it, saying you're a man of good character who's done nothing but help people since you arrived. And the other half? The other half is being led by Mrs. Hutchins, who's convinced you're a dangerous influence on impressionable young women." Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge that spoke to the frustration of being treated like property in discussions about her own future. Granger smiled despite the circumstances. "Mrs. Hutchins isn't entirely wrong about that. You are a different person than you were 2 months ago. Better or worse? Stronger, more confident, more yourself than you've ever been allowed to be." Granger adjusted the straps on his pack, checking his gear with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for battle. "That's what I'm most proud of, Sarah. Not the shooting, not the wilderness skills, but the way you've learned to stand up for yourself and demand the respect you deserve." "I learned it from watching you," Sarah replied. "The way you treated me like I mattered from the very first night. The way you never once made me feel like a burden or a charity case. You showed me what it looked like to be valued for who I am instead of pitied for what I can't do." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Too many horses moving too fast for a casual visit. Through the trees, Sarah could see dust clouds that spoke of a large group traveling with urgent purpose. The federal marshals had arrived, and they had brought enough men to handle any resistance they might encounter. "Remember what I taught you," Granger said, checking the loads in his weapons one final time. "Trust your instincts, stay calm under pressure, and never let anyone make you doubt your own worth." "Where will you go?" Sarah asked, though they both knew he wasn't planning to run this time. "Nowhere," Granger replied simply. "I'm done running, Sarah. Whatever happens, happens here, with witnesses who can tell the truth about what kind of man I really am." The marshals emerged from the tree line in formation, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun like small shields against doubt or mercy. At their head rode a man whose bearing spoke of career military service, translated into civilian law enforcement, straight-backed, clean-shaven, with the kind of eyes that saw the world in terms of regulations and jurisdictions rather than human complexity. Marcus Granger, the lead marshal called, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. By order of the United States Army, you are under arrest for desertion in the face of the enemy and for the murder of Colonel Harrison Wade. I'm not resisting, Granger replied, raising his hands to show they were empty. But I request the right to speak in my own defense before you take me. You'll have plenty of time to speak at your court-martial, the marshal replied. Right now, I need you to step away from your weapons and submit to restraint. Sarah watched. The scene unfold with the strange clarity that came from extreme stress. Everything seemed sharp-edged and slow, each detail burning itself into her memory with painful precision. She saw Annie Patterson riding hard toward the camp with Dr. Jameson and a group of townspeople behind her. She saw Deputy Collins positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. She saw Jake Morrison, sober for once, sitting his horse at the edge of the clearing with an expression of profound regret. But most clearly, she saw Granger, calm, dignified, unashamed of the choices he had made or the consequences he was prepared to face. He submitted to the shackles without protest, though Sarah could see the way his jaw tightened when the cold metal closed around his wrists. "Marshal!" Annie called as she reached the camp, slightly out of breath from her hard ride. "I have a petition here, signed by 43 citizens of Millbrook, attesting to this man's good character and requesting that he be treated with the consideration due to his service record and the circumstances of his alleged crimes." The marshal glanced at the document but didn't take it. "Mom, I appreciate your concern for your neighbor, but this is a military matter. Civilian opinions don't change the facts of desertion and murder. They change the context," Dr. Jameson interjected, dismounting and approaching the group with the measured confidence of an educated man. "I have here sworn statements from 3 of Captain Granger's former subordinates, all testifying to Colonel Wade's unfitness for command and his explicit orders to commit what can only be described as war crimes." For the first time, the marshal looked uncertain. He had come expecting to arrest a fugitive deserter, not to wade into questions of military ethics and competing versions of historical events. "I'll need to see those statements," he said finally. As Dr. Jameson handed over the papers, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She wheeled her chair forward until she was positioned between Granger and the marshals, her small frame forming a symbolic barrier that everyone present understood. "This man saved my life," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with remarkable clarity. "Not from physical danger, but from despair. He took a broken girl that her own father had thrown away and helped her become someone who could stand up for herself and for the people she cares about." She looked directly at the lead marshal, meeting his eyes without flinching. "If you want to arrest him, you'll have to explain to this community why you're taking away the best man we've ever known." "Miss, this is not your concern. Everything about this man is my concern," Sarah replied firmly. "He's my family. He's my teacher. He's the person who showed me that having limitations doesn't mean accepting less than I deserve." She gestured toward the gathered townspeople, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and protective anger. "And he's a member of this community who has earned the right to be judged by the full truth of his actions, not just the parts that fit in a military report." The marshal looked around the clearing, taking in the hostile faces of the townspeople, the sworn statements in his hands, and the dignified courage of the young woman who refused to be intimidated by federal authority. This wasn't the simple arrest he had expected, and the political implications of dragging a popular community member away in chains were becoming clear. "I still have my orders," he said finally, but his voice lacked some of its earlier certainty. "Then follow them," Granger said quietly, "but do it knowing that these people have seen the truth about who I am and what I stand for. Do it knowing that Sarah Morrison has become the remarkable woman she was always meant to be, and that no amount of military bureaucracy can change that. As the marshals prepared to lead him away, Granger caught Sarah's eye one final time. The compass in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward something more fundamental, the true direction of honor, courage, and love that transcends law and circumstance. "Take care of yourself," he said simply, "and remember that you are capable of anything you set your mind to." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady as she replied, "I'll remember everything you taught me, and I'll be here when you come home." The modified saddle fit Sarah's frame perfectly, its leather straps and supportive cushioning allowing her to maintain balance and control even at a full gallop. Granger had spent weeks perfecting the design during the long winter months after his arrest, working by lamplight in the evenings to create something that would give her complete independence on horseback. Now, as dawn broke over the high country and federal marshals prepared to transport him to his court-martial, that independence was about to be tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. Sarah guided her horse along the ridge trail with practiced ease, her rifle secure in its custom scabbard, and her eyes scanning the terrain below for signs of movement. The skills Granger had taught her, map reading, tracking, tactical thinking, were no longer academic exercises, but tools of survival in a game where the stakes were measured in years of freedom or the finality of a military execution. Word had reached Millbrook 3 days earlier that the prison wagon carrying Granger had been ambushed by bandits seeking the federal payroll that was traveling with the same convoy. In the chaos of the attack, Granger had escaped his shackles and disappeared into the wilderness, making him not just a deserter and accused murderer, but an escaped federal prisoner. The bounty on his head had tripled overnight, drawing every bounty hunter and glory seeker within 100 miles to the hunt. But Sarah knew something the hunters didn't. She knew how Granger thought, where he would go, what routes he would choose to stay ahead of his pursuers. More importantly, she knew that he wouldn't abandon the territory while she remained in it, which meant he was probably holed up somewhere within a day's ride of Millbrook, waiting for an opportunity to make contact. The sound of approaching riders made her guide her horse into the cover of a stand of pines where she could observe without being seen. 3 men on tired horses picked their way along the valley floor, their weapons ready and their eyes alert for any sign of their quarry. Sarah recognized the type. Professional hunters who tracked human prey for money rather than justice. Men who would shoot first and sort out the details later. Through her field glasses, another of Granger's practical gifts, Sarah watched them. Pause at a stream crossing where bootprints in the mud told a story only someone trained in tracking could read. She could see from their gestures and the way they split up to examine different sections of ground that they had found sign of their target. Moving with the careful silence Granger had drilled into her during countless hours of practice, Sarah repositioned her horse to get a better view of the hunter's movements. Her modified saddle allowed her to shift her weight and adjust her position without the noise and awkwardness that might betray her presence to experienced outdoorsmen. The lead hunter, a lean man with the weathered face of someone who lived rough, pointed toward a narrow canyon that cut into the eastern face of the mountain. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized they were heading directly toward the hidden cave where she and Granger had cached supplies during their early training sessions. If he was there, they would find him within the hour. Without conscious thought, Sarah found herself guiding her horse down toward the valley floor, using every technique Granger had taught her about moving unseen through hostile territory. Her mind raced through tactical options, even as her body responded with the automatic precision that came from months of disciplined practice. The hunters had made a crucial mistake. They were so focused on tracking their quarry that they had failed to watch their own back trail. Sarah was able to close within rifle range before the rearmost rider even realized he was being followed. Her first shot took the man's hat clean off his head, the crack of the rifle echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The second shot, fired before the echo of the first had faded, put a hole through his saddle horn and sent his horse rearing in alarm. "Next shot won't be a warning," Sarah called, her voice carrying the authority that Granger had helped her develop. "Throw down your weapons and ride out of here." The three hunters wheeled their horses to face this unexpected threat, their faces showing confusion and disbelief as they tried to reconcile the deadly, accurate shooting with the young woman in the modified saddle. In their experience, disabled people were victims, not threats, an assumption that Sarah was counting on to give her the advantage. "Little girl," the leader called, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that Sarah had learned to hate. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. We're federal marshals pursuing an escaped prisoner." "No, you're not," Sarah replied calmly, keeping her rifle trained on the center of his chest. "Federal marshals travel with badges and warrants. Bounty hunters travel light and shoot to kill." Her words carried the ring of truth that comes from careful observation and accurate deduction. The men facing her were clearly what she had identified them as: hired guns pursuing a payday, rather than officers of the law pursuing justice. "The man you're hunting is under the protection of this community," Sarah continued, never wavering in her aim, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "You have 30 seconds to decide whether collecting that bounty is worth dying for." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each second weighted with the potential for violence that could change everything in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah felt the compass in her pocket pressing against her side, its familiar weight reminding her that true north wasn't always the easiest direction to follow, but it was always the right one. The family compass lay cracked across its face where a bullet had struck it, but the needle still pointed steadily toward magnetic north, a testament to the quality of its construction and the enduring nature of true direction, even when damaged by violence. Sarah clutched it in her palm as she and Granger made their final stand in Millbrook Canyon, the same narrow gorge where he had earned his military nickname 15 years earlier. "Should have known you'd find your way back here," Sarah said, trying to keep fear out of her voice as armed men positioned themselves on the canyon rim above them. The bounty hunters she had confronted earlier had been joined by a dozen others, drawn by the promise of easy money and the challenge of bringing down the legendary ghost of Millbrook Canyon. "Some circles have to be closed," Granger replied, checking the loads in his weapons with the methodical calm of a man who had faced impossible odds before. "Besides, this is the one place where the terrain gives us a fighting chance." The canyon walls rose 60 feet on either side, carved by centuries of flash floods into a maze of natural fortifications and hidden positions. Rock formations provided cover, while narrow ledges offered elevated firing positions for those brave or foolish enough to use them. It was perfect defensive terrain for someone who knew its secrets, but it was also a trap. There was only one way in and one way out. Sarah had positioned herself behind a fallen boulder that provided protection while allowing her a clear field of fire across the canyon mouth. Her modified rifle rest, damaged in the morning's skirmish but still functional, gave her the stability she needed for accurate long-range shooting. More importantly, her presence here sent a message to their attackers that this wasn't just about capturing a fugitive. This was about protecting family. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, multiplied and distorted, until it seemed like an army was descending upon them. Sarah felt her mouth go dry as the first riders appeared at the canyon's entrance, their weapons drawn and their faces set with the grim determination of men who had come too far to turn back empty-handed. But mixed among the bounty hunters and opportunistic gun hands, Sarah spotted familiar faces from Millbrook. Annie Patterson riding a sturdy mare, Dr. Jameson looking uncomfortable but determined on an unfamiliar horse, even Deputy Collins with his badge glinting in the afternoon. "Son." Behind them came Jake Morrison, her father, swaying slightly in his saddle but more sober than she had seen him in months. "Granger," Annie called, her voice echoing off the stone walls. We've got news from the territorial capital. The governor has agreed to review your case based on the evidence we've gathered. That's real nice, Mrs. Patterson, the lead bounty hunter replied, his scarred face splitting into a predatory grin. But we've got federal warrants and the legal right to take this man dead or alive. Government reviews don't change that. Sarah saw Granger's jaw tighten as he recognized the impossible position they were all in. Legal process and frontier justice were about to collide in this narrow canyon, with her caught in the middle of forces beyond any one person's control. There's another way, Jake Morrison said, his voice carrying across the canyon with surprising strength. He guided his horse forward until he was positioned between the bounty hunters and the canyon where his daughter and Granger had made their stand. I'm the one who started this whole mess. I'm the one who drove my daughter away with my drinking and my grief. Maybe it's time I finished it. Father, don't, Sarah called. But Jake was already dismounting, his movements more steady than they had been in years. I've been a coward and a failure as a father, Jake said, looking directly at Sarah. But I won't be a coward about this. These men want someone to blame for the situation we're in? Then let them blame me. I'll surrender myself as an accessory to harboring a fugitive if it means my daughter and the man who's been more of a father to her than I ever was can have a chance to prove their innocence. The gesture was noble and desperate and ultimately futile. Jake Morrison's surrender wouldn't satisfy men who had come for the bounty on Granger's head, but it bought them precious seconds and shifted the moral weight of the confrontation in ways that even hardened killers couldn't entirely ignore. That was when the real surprise arrived. A column of blue uniformed cavalry riding hard into the canyon with a young lieutenant at their head. Sarah recognized the insignia of the territorial militia, called out by the governor in response to reports of armed conflicts and vigilante justice in the region. By order of Territorial Governor Crawford, the lieutenant announced, his voice cracking slightly with youth and nervousness. All parties are to stand down immediately. Captain Granger is to be taken into protective custody, pending a full review of his case by a military tribunal. The compass in Sarah's hand seemed to pulse, with warmth as true north, finally aligned with justice. The cracked face couldn't obscure the steady direction of the needle, pointing toward hope despite the damage it had sustained. It's over, Granger said quietly, though whether he was speaking to Sarah or to himself remained unclear. No, Sarah replied, raising her voice so it carried across the canyon to where all the assembled forces could hear her. Now it begins. The wooden sign swayed gently in the morning breeze, its hand-painted letters bright against the weathered board. Granger and daughter, Wilderness Guides and Protection Services. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in Millbrook Canyon. 6 months since the Territorial Tribunal had vindicated Marcus Granger's actions at Wounded Knee and cleared him of all charges related to preventing what would have been a massacre of innocent civilians. Sarah adjusted the sign's position with the long-handled tool Granger had crafted for her, ensuring it was visible to travelers approaching their cabin from the main trail. The business had grown beyond their most optimistic expectations, drawing clients from across the territory who sought guides with unparalleled knowledge of the high country and the rare combination of tactical expertise and genuine care for their customers' safety. Another telegram from Denver, Granger called from the cabin's front porch, waving the yellow paper with obvious satisfaction. The Merchant Association wants to hire us to escort their payroll shipments through the mountain passes. Seems our reputation for discouraging bandits has spread further than we thought. Sarah wheeled her chair up the wooden ramp that Granger had built to make the cabin fully accessible, noting how naturally she moved through spaces designed with her needs in mind. The months of practical experience had taught them both that accommodation wasn't about limitation. It was about intelligent design that allowed everyone to contribute their best efforts. That's the third inquiry this week, she said, spreading the telegram on the table beside their account ledger. We're going to need help if we keep growing like this. Already thought of that, Granger replied, pouring coffee into 2 cups with the easy domesticity that had developed between them. Annie Patterson's nephew is coming up from Santa Fe next month. Young man with military experience and a good head for business. Figured we could train him to handle the routine escort work while we focus on the more challenging assignments. Sarah nodded approvingly, running her finger down the neat columns of figures that tracked their earnings and expenses. The business had provided them with something she had never expected to possess: genuine financial independence and the respect that came with being recognized for their competence rather than their limitations. Outside their window, the small cemetery where Jake Morrison lay buried caught the morning light. Sarah's father had lived only 3 months after the confrontation in the canyon, finally succumbing to the combination of liver damage and self-neglect that had been destroying him for years. But those final months had been different. He had stayed sober, had worked to rebuild the relationship with his daughter, and had died knowing that she had forgiven him for his failures as a father. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, following Granger's gaze toward the grave marker. "Taking responsibility for someone else's broken child." Granger looked at her with the expression she had come to treasure, one that saw her accomplishments rather than her obstacles, her strength rather than her struggles. "The only thing I regret is that it took us so long to find each other. And Sarah, you were never broken. You were just waiting for someone to see what you were capable of." A knock at their door interrupted the conversation, followed by the sound of Annie Patterson's voice calling a cheerful greeting. Sarah smiled as she opened the door to find their friend and unofficial business partner standing on the porch with a young woman beside her. "Sarah Granger, I'd like you to meet Rebecca." "Chen," Annie said, gesturing to her companion. "She's traveled all the way from San Francisco after hearing about your success story. She has a proposal that I think you'll find interesting." Rebecca was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with intelligent dark eyes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making her own way in the world. She walked with the aid of crutches, her left leg bearing obvious signs of some past injury, but moved with the purposeful grace of someone who had long since adapted to her circumstances. "Miss Morrison, Mr. Granger," Rebecca said, accepting Sarah's invitation to sit at their table. "I represent a group of investors in California who are interested in establishing a network of wilderness guide services throughout the Western Territories. We've been following your work here, and we're impressed by both your professional competence and your innovative approaches to accommodation and inclusion." She opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the table. "We'd like to offer you the opportunity to expand your operation, to train other teams using your methods, to show the world that capability comes in many forms and that the most effective partnerships are often the most unexpected ones." Sarah felt her heart race as she studied the contracts and financial projections. The offer represented more than business expansion. It represented the chance to prove that what they had built in Millbrook could be replicated elsewhere, that other people like herself could find opportunity and respect in places they had never imagined possible. "What would you need from us?" Granger asked, though his tone suggested he was already considering the possibilities. "Your expertise, your training methods, and most importantly, your willingness to serve as examples of what can be accomplished when society stops limiting people based on superficial assessments of their abilities." Rebecca's voice carried the passion of someone who had faced similar challenges herself. "We want to change how the world thinks about disability, about partnership, about the untapped potential that exists in every community." As Sarah and Granger exchanged glances across the table, both of them understanding that another crossroads had appeared in their lives, Sarah fingered the compass in her pocket. The crack across its face had been carefully repaired with gold, making it stronger and more beautiful than it had been before the damage. True north, she had learned, wasn't always the easiest direction to follow, but it was always the right one. "When do we start?" Sarah asked, her voice steady with the confidence that had grown from months of proving herself capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. Outside their window, the sign creaked gently in the breeze, announcing to the world that Granger and daughter were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would continue building something that mattered, not just a business, but a legacy of dignity, opportunity, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved the chance to discover their own potential. The story that had begun with a drunken father's cruel joke had become something neither of them could have predicted, a testament to the transformative power of respect, patience, and love. And it was only the beginning.